I think they're both planning to attend at some point. I'm not sure
Right.
what the calendars are.
We got some more. All right. We're waiting for 3 more to have a quorum.
I can get on from my phone too, if that helps. Then we have one more.
So I could do that too. Then we'd have 4. To change your title here, just be like Kevin, and then do Sheriff Big on the other one.
Yep.
Josie. Let's double check my email, make sure nobody's having trouble. Okay. 2 more. Getting there.
Counting down. The last person comes, we're all going to cheer. Yay! Or boo,
Yay.
I'm not sure. I'll just say for the record, this is not true of every day, but I earned my pay today. This is one of those days of back to back to back to back to back, everything. And it's like, I think I earned my pay today. Now I'm saying that's not true of every single day, but today was one of those days.
Absolutely is true every day, Chris. Hear about all the meetings.
No, today was one of those days.
Frank Fagan always tells me, well, I have to go to a meeting with DHS because it's a day that ends in Y.
I do notice though that my ears don't get sore anymore. In the early days of COVID, my ears would hurt so bad by the end of the day from them getting squished by my headphones.
And conditioned.
They are. I mean, yep. One time, many, many years ago, many, many, many years ago, I was on in a case that needed they were selecting the jury and they ran out of jury pool. So they went out just to look for some people that could be on the jury pool. And so maybe we could just go out and find some CJCC members.
Oh, Shelley Jo Metzger is not going to be able to join us today. But we do have Colleen, so that's
Nice.
good. All right, we need 1 more. And we're gonna all have to cheer.
Yep. Who are our other potentials, Sarah?
Chief Atkinson, Jim Tripp, Katie Shalley, Jamie Kraus, Chief Spetz,
What if we just send out an email reminder?
KT Gallagher. I'm sorry.
Can we just send out like an email reminder quick?
No, I was just gonna see if there were any of them I could just text. So I'm texting Chief Atkinson.
And I just talked to Katie a minute ago. I'll give her a call.
Josie, your audio is pretty muted and it's really quiet.
Okay.
I know that Jamie Kraus was trying to join and then a victim showed up, so she got slapped.
I had some bandwidth problems. Did anybody else have that with Andrea?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And what,
Yeah, at the same time.
hard to tell if where the source is coming from.
I
Okay.
think I understood her to say that Jamie had a victim or witness show up and so she got pulled away.
So if we have a quorum and we lose our quorum, do we have to quit? Or do you just have to have a quorum to start?
I think we just need a quorum to start, right?
All right, so Chief said he could jump on for a second.
It'll be, Katie will be coming as well.
All right. There you go.
I think this is something we're gonna have to address moving forward, because if we don't have enough people for a meeting, it's problematic. That happened nearly at our last operations committee meeting as well.
Yep.
Or maybe reevaluate.
Well, and part of it is the size of our group.
Okay, I've
You
got
need a lot of people.
we can start.
All right, Chief is here.
All right. So I will call the meeting to order. We have verified that we have a quorum. I don't know that we need to do introductions per se. Do you think, Sarah?
Yes,
Do-
I think we do.
Okay.
We've got a couple new people joining us today, and even though this is just half of our group, I think introductions would be helpful.
All right. So I'm Chris Corpola. I'm the Human Services Director and the chairperson for the CJCC for this year. Sarah?
I'm Sarah Benedict. I'm the Criminal Justice Coordinator here in Dunn County. Sheriff?
Dunn County Sheriff Kevin Bigd.
Judge Peterson?
Judge James Peterson, the Branch 1 Circuit Court Judge.
Aaron?
Aaron Cernahouse, Corrections Field Supervisor for Dunn County, outgoing Supervisor for Dunn County.
Michelle?
Michelle Barrow, current agent in Chippewa Falls, but incoming supervisor for Menominee.
Nice to have you here.
Thank you.
Colleen?
Spot, the program director for the Criminal Justice and Rehab Program at UW Stouts.
Thank you for being here. Andrea and Jamie?
Andrea Nodoff, the district attorney in Dunn County.
And Jamie Kraus, Victim Witness Coordinator in Dunn County.
All right. Chief?
I'm Eric Atkinson. I'm the Chief of Police for the Menominee Police Department.
Dave?
David Bartlett, Dunn County Board Chair.
Josie?
Josie La Liberty, Child Support Director.
Katie,
Katie Shalley, Clerk of Court.
Allison,
Allison Morris, City Prosecutor for the City of Menominee.
Judge Wagner,
Luke Wagner, Judge of Dunn County Circuit Court, Branch 3.
and Judge Meyer. And we're gaining Jim Tripp out of the deal too. So Judge Meyer is Dunn County Branch 2, and Jim Tripp is County Board Supervisor. Speaking for you, Jim.
Sorry, I'm late. I was painting deck railings and got into a zone.
So actually we're running a bit late too because we were waiting for a quorum, but I think we are surpassed that now, so we're good to go.
Then I doubly apologize.
So I would look for a motion for approval of the meeting minutes from our last quarterly meeting on July 15th of 2021.
Kevin Big so moves.
I'll second that. Dave Bartlett.
All right. Any discussion, additions, or corrections to those minutes? Otherwise, all those in favor of approving them signify by saying aye.
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 All right. I'm assuming we probably don't have any public comment, Krista?
No public comment.
Okay. And so we have some action items. We need to confirm the citizen members of the 2022 CJCC. There are 2 citizen seats. And so Sarah, do you want to talk about that for a second?
Sure. We have each year at our last meeting of the year, we elect citizen members for the council membership for the next year. So this year we've had Shelley Jo Metzger with Arbor Place. She has both the professional experience, but she also has lived experience that she brings to our group. She's not able to be here today, but she was nominated for the 2022 council. And then we reached out to Colleen Etzbach. She is the, she mentioned, the program director for UW Stouts Rehabilitation and Criminal Justice Program. Previously, we've had Carrie Acklin, who had that position on our board. Carrie's moved on to other things, but we reached out to Colleen, just really recognizing the connections that we have with Stout and all the benefits that can come with that collaboration. So she was interested in being part of our council, and the Operations Executive Committee actually did approve her nomination. So the nomination for Shelley Jo and for Colleen comes before the CJCC for voting. And again, this is for a 1-year term. It would be for the 2022 year.
So given that, I would entertain a motion to confirm Shelley Jo Metzger and Colleen Etzbach as the citizen members for the CJCC for 2022.
So moved.
Kevin?
I'll second.
David? Any discussion? Otherwise, all those in favor of that signify by saying aye.
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 Motion same, or opposed, same sign. Motion carries. All right, staff report.
A written staff report was included in the meeting packet along with our data dashboards for June, July, and August. Any questions that anybody might have, or any that was included or not included in that packet, I can certainly field.
All right. Item number 7, grants update.
All right, so to give a general update, and then Chris, please feel free to chime in. I'm going to start with some of the CJCC grants. So the reentry grant that we have to pilot our reentry program is coming to an end at the end of the year, December 31st. That has been a 4-year grant that was supporting our peer support specialist in the contract with the Center for Independent Living. That was a pilot project, so that is going to be sunsetting at the end of the year. The Center for Independent Living is going to retain that position and going to continue to provide reentry services under their organization. So while we won't have that formal connection with them, they'll still be providing that service out in the community and for folks that are interested in taking part in that. Some of the other services with the reentry grant were jail programming to get it up to the evidence-based threshold, and also assessment and reentry planning in jail. We hope that those services can continue in the future, but just with staffing constraints in the jail, it has been challenging just to maintain the existing program just due to staffing, frankly. And then we've got the COVID situation on top of it, which has made just kind of the opening of the doors to the jailhouse, not very practical because of the COVID situation again. So we hope to continue the reentry services, but we will not have funding past the end of the year. Any questions on reentry before I go on to the next? All right. Next grant that we have is our Treatment Alternatives and Diversion grant that supports our top program, Treatment Opportunity. So this year will end our grant cycle. The application has been submitted for the next 4-year grant cycle to begin in 2022. So we're really looking at maintaining the program components as we have them, and just really increasing the budget to allow for staff, just the kind of the cost of living adjustments that we typically have each year. Those awards will be determined in the next couple of months, and the funding will be for January. So we anticipate that will be funded. Next year, there will be additional funds. So if we do want to expand or make some additional changes, we'll have an opportunity to do that next year as well. The Department of Justice Coronavirus Emergency Supplemental Funding Grant is also through the end of the year. That this is the second round. So this is for the law enforcement and courtroom safety upgrades. So this includes the filtration system in the jail, which has been installed, the UV sanitation devices, which the Sheriff's Department has purchased. Squad laptops are on order and should be arriving here maybe even as early as tomorrow. One of the things that we've had kind of sitting out there and a decision hasn't been made has been on the digital evidence system. We're looking at 2 different systems. One is within our current RMS system, and then one is kind of an additional system. So we know that folks are taking a look at those. I did receive word from DOJ that they would allow us to have a 6-month extension on that grant if we really cannot make a decision and move forward before the end of the year. So I think that was reassuring, just as the clock keeps on ticking here. So, but that is one that will have to, just the decision needs to be made, and then the purchase portion there. And then we've also, Chris Corpola, chair of this group, and myself and some other folks, certainly Chief Atkinson's been a big part of it. We've been working and looking at other grant opportunities as they come across our computer screens. There's a lot of funding out there that has been presented as a quick opportunity. So if I can turn it over to Chris to give us some updates on a couple of those that are coming our way.
All right. So most, if not all of you, are aware that we had some grant funding to both pay for emergency housing services in the form of hotel stays through stepping stones through the colder part of the winter, as well as to develop 2 transition houses for people that are leaving incarceration or treatment. Those 2 transition houses have been operational since early this summer or late spring, and they have been full almost since their inception. There are 11 beds between those 2 houses, 1 for men and 1 for women. So the first grant opportunity that we had was expansion of a current grant that the Department of Human Services receives that was supplemental COVID pass-through money that comes earmarked with certain ways that you have to spend it. It's part of our substance abuse and mental health block grant money from the feds. And that part of that money is going to go to help the so one of the pieces of the learning curve to this project for the transitional houses is how much supports that you need to try to get people to eliminate the obstacles to permanent housing and get people transitioned into permanent housing. So this will go to some additional case management support for that project. The other part of that money will go towards the mental health work group or action team from the Health Done Right Community Health Coalition has published or put online a local resource directory, but that's pretty robust. There's also a paper form of that. So a small amount of that money will be able to go towards publishing those paper forms. And then the alcohol, it's called alcohol, nicotine and drug action team has been working on trying to do some raised awareness of how to access treatment resources, and some of that substance abuse block grant money that has to go towards prevention will be able to earmark towards doing some more professionalized promotion of how to access treatment resources or some version of that within our community. We wrote a $75,000 a year for 2-year grant to the Wisconsin Youth Prevention Project from the Department of Children and Family Services. Received notification yesterday that was granted. That'll be passed through money that will go to the city of Menominee, the police department, to further operationalize some of their work with Project Hope, implementation of the Botvan life skills curriculum at the middle school level in the Menominee School District, and it'll help to offset some officer time in the purchase of materials, which has been a piece of what we've been sort of poised and ready to move forward with, but haven't had funding for. And then the Department of Administration recently released round 2 of CDBG funding. We went through the tedious process of obtaining that funding for our transition houses and emergency housing. And then have learned that we would not need to resubmit. They'll allow us to amend and expand our current grant. So all of our pieces are all in place. And so we just have to come up with our new plan and how much money we want to spend. And honestly, they're having a really hard time spending the money. And so they advised us to be ambitious in our expenditure of that. So we're looking at doing some things to expand some additional transitional housing resources. And again, these are all systems that are set up in place with stepping stones and West Cap. And so really it's just additional pass-through money. In addition, I think we'll be able to assist stepping stones with that money to do some food pantry renovation that they need to create a walk-in cooler, large walk-in cooler. So anyway, we're still in the works on some of those sorts of things, but we did all the heavy lifting already on that grant, and now we get to reap the benefit of that by just spending more of the Department of Administration's COVID money. So I would anticipate that our next round of requests will be over $1 million on that particular grant. So those are the things. Any questions about those?
I have a question, Chris. Who administrates that? Does the county or?
They do.
They do.
Yeah, we do. But like I said, we've already put all those like processes in place. So we actually just submitted our first payment request. So our part at this point, after all the tedious work that we did for all the approvals, our part at this point in time is essentially collecting all the receipts and submitting them to the DOA to get reimbursed funding. So it's pretty, I did do some vetting with, and we'll continue as we move forward with this, but with our finance crew, just to make sure that we can manage the workload. But we also are able to claim administrative money for that. And we're actually backfilling a little bit of my time. And I do time tracking for that particular funding and some of our fiscal time as well to cover the time.
The other two grants you mentioned, do we administer them too, or does somebody else?
No, the substance abuse and mental health block grant money is already money that we receive to the tune of about $70,000 a year. And basically it's a supplement to that money that came earmarked with certain ways that you have to spend it. So we've already got that process set up. And then the mental or the Wisconsin Youth Prevention money comes from the Department of Children's Services as an addition to our existing contract with them.
Okay, thank you.
So those are all good things. All right, Sarah, CJCC Program Recidivism Project.
All right. Beginning last year, we, our CJCC and our data work group really wanted to dive into program recidivism measures and to track over time how the programs are doing. We presented that information last November to the group and really wanted to revisit that annually. So I do have the update for the information for 2020. However, with us almost at the end of 2021 here, I guess propose that we move this from the end of the year to the beginning of the year so we have the most recent data. I'm going to share some of the highlights that we have, but I'm going to make it brief due to time. And we've got an education component coming up. But as mentioned, I'd like to revisit this at one of our earlier meetings in the year where we can have the clean end of the year 2021. So I'm going to just share my screen quickly. All right. So do you guys see a report here? Anybody?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so this is the, again, just the updated report based on the parameters and the protocol that we had set up last year. We spent a lot of time setting up this project. It was very collaborative. We had the clerk of courts busy giving us information, and our records staff from the sheriff's department and the police department. We've had a lot of folks involved in this. It's ongoing. It's something that we're going to be really measuring each year kind of consistently. So the programs that we took a look at were our pre-charge diversion program, the treatment opportunity program, and the treatment court program. Looking at measures of evaluation, we really looked at completion rates to begin with. And then we had a broad interpretation of recidivism. We really wanted to know who is even getting charges, criminal charges. That could be charges or convictions. So again, this is like really big net recidivism measures here. We also wanted to factor in the cost savings, cost avoidances. Those things are harder to quantify. But there's certainly benefits that we receive when crime is reduced. And then there's community impacts. This report I can send out after the fact, so I'm not going to go into all the detail. But I do want to just point out some of the highlights. And when we're talking about cost savings, the State Department of Justice really came out, crunched the numbers across the state with the different diversion programs and the treatment court programs. And they found for every dollar that they invest or is invested in diversion programs that the criminal justice system saves $8.68. For every dollar invested in treatment courts, the savings is about $4.17 to the criminal justice system. Average cost of that incarceration per year is about $35,000. It varies from $32,000 to $39,000 depending on gender, but the cost is pretty expensive when we're talking about containment. Community impacts when we're talking about rehabilitation of this population. There's that economic development. There's employment and all the things that come with that. It's taking care of families. It's reducing harm to the individuals and their families. It's also reducing the factors that contribute to the reoffending. So really addressing those crime risk factors, what we call criminogenic needs. And then it makes our community a healthier place to be overall when people are have that rehabilitation versus really cycling through the criminal justice system. The executive summary, the kind of short notes here, the numbers for the pre-charge diversion program have been pretty solid. There are a few discrepancies that need to be fleshed out with our deferred prosecution coordinator, just slight variations that I don't think are statistically important, but we do want to make sure the numbers match. But overall, when we're looking at the pre-charge diversion, the trend has been steady. We've had about 75 to 73% of the people that take part in that program complete the program, and that was through the end of 2020. When we look at the one-year recidivism rate for this program, only about 7 to 8% recidivate. So this is really that first-time offender, kind of made some, the first time they're interacting with the criminal justice system, tend to be low risk. It kind of bears out what the research is telling us, that the less we do with the low risk, we can get some big rewards here. The 3-year recidivism is also a very small sample, but is held pretty steady at about 13%. When we're looking at the treatment opportunity program, so that's folks that they have been charged with a crime, they have been, that has some sort of component to drugs or alcohol or the driving factor related to the criminal activity. And if they are interested in the program and it's acceptable to the district attorney's office and their attorney, we can get them in a treatment opportunity program. Typically, those last from 6 to 12 to 24 months. So it's a different group of people than in our pre-charge diversion program. The completion rates there have been steady from 2019 to 2020. So we're about 62% of those that start the program complete the program. Looking at 1-year recidivism, since we have a greater number of people that reach that 1-year point, we are seeing that the recidivism levels reduce. So it's about 21% of those that complete recidivate within 1 year. And then we don't have the data yet. We haven't got to that 3-year point to look at the recidivisms. We'll have that at the end of 2021. So that's part of the reason I'm wanting to bring this back early next year and maybe get on the calendar early in the year each year. Looking at the treatment court program. So this is our highest risk, highest need, most intensive program. These are the folks that are cycling through the criminal justice system, have many episodes in and out of the criminal justice system and have a treatment need. The completion rate there has been pretty steady. So this program's been operational since 2008. Very small cohorts each year in this program. But the completion rates have been pretty steady. So about 50%, 51% of the people that start the program complete the program. The other 50% or so are terminated due to lack of participation or continued use or continued criminal type behavior. For the recidivism measures for treatment court, trending higher overall. So about 20, we went from 23% recidivism rate at the 1-year mark to 29%. So I'll show you numbers here in a minute, but since the numbers are small, just a few people that reoffend can bump that up quite a bit. And then our 3-year recidivism rate definitely bumped up. We went from 30% to 45%. So again, the numbers are small, so any swings can be pretty noticeable. So that's just kind of the summary. In the report, we do have descriptions of the program, and then the specifics as far as the numbers of graduates and those that recidivate for each of the programs. And then we do have a chart on page 7 that really lines up the nitty-gritty specifics, so you can get a better sense of where the recidivation is happening. The riskiest years, that first year, that those numbers have been fairly good, but over time the effects of the treatment and the rehabilitation programs can wane. We do have some comparisons out there. It's hard to have an apple-to-apple comparison. It's hard to have a risk level to risk level comparison, but a few would be the DOC. We do have an updated report from the Department of Corrections from August, giving us their recidivism measures, and we're comparing that just a new charge, not necessarily if that's a reincarceration, but the numbers are pretty high there as well. So about 31% of all DOC prisoners are reoffend. And then when we look at the 3-year mark, it's at about 52%. So again, that's not an apple-to-apple comparison, but it does give us a general sense of that prison track and what that might look like. A little bit more detailed information on some of the comparison is on the last page. And again, this is just as of today's date, so the numbers will change, but I will just send this out to the group for consumption. And then when we get it updated at the end of the year, that'll be part of the annual report, and that'll come back out as well. Any questions on that super fast review of recidivism? All right. I think one piece we'll bring back to the operations group, I think, is our definition of recidivism. I think it's too broad for really what we're trying to communicate. So I think that's something that would be nice to tighten up a little bit. So instead of any criminal charge, have it a criminal conviction versus just a charge.
I think that's all relative. I mean, depending on, how the case is handled on new charges, we charge people all the time that aren't convicted through one path or another, but I guess that's debatable.
Right, Sheriff. Yep, and that's why when the data group designed it, we really wanted that bigger approach, because even if there is a charge, there's still criminal justice resources going towards that, even if they are found not guilty. But I think part of the challenge is when we're trying to show the effectiveness of programs, charges that aren't turning into convictions give a false sense of recidivism as well. It can, anyways, doesn't always.
All right. And I think that's somewhat perfect timing to just reiterating that we kind of committed at the beginning of the year to spending a small amount of time in these meetings with some shared educational materials that would kind of just give us a increasingly shared language for the work that we're doing. And so Sarah has found another, last time we watched a short video piece from a training that we did internally. And this is another one that Sarah has found for us on addictions that is particularly well done. And I think about 20 minutes long, right?
That's right. So this is shorter than our last video, and it is about 20 minutes long, and it is kind of in that layman's terms, but can really, I think, help illustrate why the folks that we see that have methamphetamine addiction issues really struggle, and why the threat of punishment isn't always as effective as we think it would be. So I'm going to go ahead and share the screen, and we'll get the video going. I'll also send it out after the fact so folks can share it with their staff. Again, it's, I think, nicely done, and really hits home on why we struggle as a criminal justice system dealing with this health issue. So here we go. Maybe. Am I still sharing stuff? Let me get rid of this stuff here. Hold on. All right. Okay. So do you see my video? I'm not sure what you guys see. Okay, here we go.
Why is addiction a disease that we have to understand?
Can you hear it?
The main reason for this is 21 million people in the United States have the disease of addiction. 15 million of those suffer from an alcohol use disorder, and 3 million of those suffer from an opioid use disorder. An opioid use disorder is an addiction to things like painkillers and heroin. It's the #1 cause of injury-related death in our country. The #1 cause, more than car accidents and gun violence. In 2015, we had over 50,000 people die of overdose. 50,000 people of a preventable disease. The CDC even called this an epidemic. And so now what we have are people who have a disease that we can identify, that we can treat, but we're not. So how are we going to stem the tide of this problem? Well, let's go back and start about thinking in a way that we can understand addiction from a human standpoint. So we need 3 things to survive. You need food, you need water, you need dopamine. Now, some of the people who get a little antsy say we also need oxygen. Yes, well, we also need skin, but I'm not going to really talk about that today. We're going to talk about the 3 things we absolutely need to survive as a human in today's world, and that is food, water, and dopamine. We need dopamine because it's the chemical responsible for motivation. It's this thing that's responsible for us going and making a friend, having a mother have a bond with a baby. It's the thing that motivates us when we do good to do better. When somebody pats you on the back and says, "Good job," and you go to do something more significant, that's because your dopamine has gotten pinged, and it's just something pushing you, this invisible chemical that's pushing you along the path. On a normal day, we even know how much dopamine we're supposed to have. So on Monday morning, when I wake up and I have to get up and I go to work, I live in the range of about 50 nanograms per deciliter of dopamine. That sits in the central part of my brain, and that's required for me to get out of bed and go get that first cup of coffee. Now, what about the worst day? The really bad day? The day you call your office and you fake vomit in the phone and you decide not to go in. You're like, I just can't make it. That's about 40 nanograms per deciliter. So not much lower, but low enough to where you just want to sit around in your pajamas all day and do nothing. What about the best day ever? You know, the day where all at once you win the lottery, you have 2% body fat, and you're living on the beach. All of those things happen at the exact same time. We even know that one. That's 100 nanograms per deciliter. Our brain is meant to go all the way to there. It's not really meant to go above. And we can look at things like your favorite food, which is like 94 nanograms per deciliter. And sex, 92 nanograms per deciliter. Bummer, right? Couldn't have predicted that. Maybe they need to redo that research. But at the same time, we know that we're supposed to live within this relative normal state between 40 on a horrible day and 100 on our best day. So what happens when we add a chemical into the brain like methamphetamine? This chemical is really important because it pushes us way past that 100 nanograms per deciliter. In fact, it actually pushes up to 1,100 nanograms per deciliter, more than 10 times the amount of dopamine that our brain should be making. And then if we look at things like marijuana or alcohol or heroin, these are things that push it up into the high hundreds. This is not what we're supposed to be doing. As we look at this, we have the normal that we're supposed to be. We have this large jump for something like methamphetamine. And then we have these other drugs that drive that dopamine up. And when that happens, it starts to take over that part of the brain. And no longer does going to your child's birthday make you happy. It's not happening. The things that normally make us feel happy start to pale in comparison. This is because the brain is built to survive. In fact, we know that this is a survival issue for the brain, mainly because dopamine is what drives us to procreate, to get food, to get water, like we talked about. And we know so much about addiction and all of these things that are going on in that part of the brain that we actually know the parts of the brain responsible for this motivation and this dopamine release. It's places like the anterior cingulate gyrus, the lateral bed nuclei of the amygdala, the nucleus accumbens, the ventral tegmental area, the periaqueductal gray. We know this. And by the end of all of these videos on this site, you're going to know exactly what each of those parts do. But for now, you should understand that this area of the brain called the limbic system, which includes, but it's not limited to, the ventral tegmental area and the nucleus accumbens, are responsible for reward. And the fact that we can look on an MRI and see these parts of the brain working, and we can see them working in a patient who is not on any drugs and those that have been on illicit substances for a long time, and see major differences in how these structures work, is really important because it allows us to start to understand things like behavior. We can see that all of the focus is on the dopamine part of the brain. Remember that nucleus accumbens and ventral tegmental area that we talked about? In that part of the brain, when you've been taking things like methamphetamine for a long time, every time that you take the methamphetamine, it goes from 1,100, then the next time maybe it's 900, then 600, then 500, then 200, then 100. Then you're required to take that drug even to get you up to that normal level of 50 nanograms per deciliter. Let's say we found this person, we get them into treatment and we remove that drug. Now we have people whose dopamine goes all the way down to as low as 10 nanograms per deciliter. And on their best day ever, it's only 20 nanograms per deciliter. These are numbers that matter, and we're going to keep hammering on these because when you have 10 nanograms per deciliter, you can't get out of bed. You can't get up to put your clothes on and go to a job interview or to even take care of yourself or your family. When we lack dopamine, the body craves it. And when you crave dopamine, you get into survival mode. And that leads to primal action. And that primal action is a lot of times the behavior that we see. How can they take grandma's jewelry? How can they steal a credit card? How can they pawn something that they owned? Their brain is telling them that they are not going to survive if they don't get dopamine. And the thing that gives them the dopamine that they need, as far as they know, is that drug of choice. Behavior is so much about how we define addiction that we even use it as the diagnosis. The DSM-5, the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual version 5, which is what all psychiatrists use to help define mental health disorders, defines addiction not based on some lab test, not based on a urine drug screen, but very much bases it on the behaviors of a person. And we break it into really 4 major areas, 4 pillars, and there are 11 criteria in those 4 pillars. And when we look at it, you look at impaired control of use of the drug, meaning you can't really say no to the next one or even the first one. We look at other things like social impairment. How much does it really mess up the people around you and the interactions that you have with your parents or your friends or your spouse or people at work? And then we have risky use. Risky use means, do I know injecting this is going to cause me to get an infection in my heart or could give me HIV or hepatitis C, but I'm still going to use it? And then we have the pharmacological properties, which are really 2 out of the 11. So 9 of these 11 have nothing to do with chemistry or labs or EKGs. It's purely based on the behavior of the person. It is unacceptable that we are removing patients out of primary care offices and any other place in the healthcare system like a hospital or an emergency department when their behavior is bad because of addiction, because that's how we define it. That is the diagnosis. So we should assume that behavior is a symptom and not a frustration. When we look at craving, which again is what drives a lot of this behavior, we actually have good data around craving and how that looks. So when we look at functional MRIs of the brain, this is a picture of the brain, and we can see areas light up, and these areas light up, consistent with what part of the brain is working and how hard it's working. We had patients who were dehydrated, were in starvation mode, and had not received their drug of choice for a period of time. We had patients who hadn't had anything to drink for 3 days. That's a long time. And these are patients who are starting to get to the point of dehydration where it's going to be survival need for water and not just I'm a little bit thirsty. So for these patients, we looked at a functional MRI, we put them in the tube in the MRI, and we would ask them questions like, tell me about a waterfall. We would play, sounds of waterfalls in the background, and we would sprinkle water on their feet and take pictures of the brain. And we can look at these areas of the brain that are responsible for craving, like the anterior cingulate gyrus, the one we talked about earlier, and it would light up to about the relative size of a baseball. We did this for food. So we had patients who didn't get any physical food per oral, meaning they didn't eat any food for 5 days. They would get some IV fluids and some vitamins because we don't want to kill people that we're trying to test. But at the same time, 5 days without food. And then we put them into the functional MRI. We then talked to them about their favorite food. We then brought their favorite food into the MRI suite, and we kind of wafted it into the MRI tube so they could smell it. And then we have them talk about how it would taste, and then we had them taste it and spit it out. And through all of these, we looked at the brain through this functional MRI, and in those same areas, instead of a baseball for dehydration, we had the size of about a basketball for starvation. So we know what people will do when they're dying of thirst or they're dying of starvation. I mean, they will rob, they will steal. I mean, imagine if you walk through the desert and in 3 days' time, you walk through the desert and you get to the end and all of a sudden there's this pedestal with a beautiful glass of water with condensation coming down the side. If it was me and I walked up to that and then somebody stepped in front of that glass of water and said, no, this is my water, I'd be like, oh, okay, stab. And I would move them out of the way and then I would take this water and I would drink that water immediately because that is survival. And people getting in the way of survival, they really put themselves at risk. And we know that. And actually, we'll kind of accept that. When people are looting stores when there's a famine, or when people are doing what they can to survive for their children or to not die, we accept those things. What about an addiction? We took patients who hadn't had their drug of choice, and in these cases, for these studies, it was alcohol and opioids. And so when we took those patients and we put them in a functional MRI and we asked them a couple of basic questions. Tell me about the first time that you used your drug and the last time that you used your drug. That's all we really asked. That craving of just thinking about the drug lit that brain up. And it lit it up no matter if you were 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, or 1 year. It was almost exactly the same. That craving signal in the brain did not decrease until 2 years. And what we found was the relative size of that craving was not a baseball or a basketball. It was a baseball field. So the craving for dopamine and that drug of choice so far outstretches the desire to not die from dehydration and starvation that it starts to make me understand why these behaviors happen so consistently among patients who have had the disease of addiction. So if dopamine is lacking in the nucleus accumbens, and this is the basis for driving this behavior, then augmentation of dopamine might make sense, right? If we raise dopamine back up to normal levels, then they won't feel craving and they won't be starving for the drug. That can then allow us to have an appropriate conversation with the patient, allow them to be engaged in treatment. So when we look at how we do that, we found that the two medications, at least for opioid use disorder, that do this are buprenorphine and methadone. By giving those medications, we actually can raise the dopamine back up to normal levels so that this person doesn't have to think about, I need my drug, because what they're really thinking is I need dopamine, I need dopamine, I need dopamine. And that starts in the morning from the second they wake up, and it is there all day. Without this, we're not able to get patients stable enough to have therapy do anything for them. Because without dopamine in the brain, what you're not getting is even onboarding of emotional memory because it's required for that. And so when they go into therapy without having their dopamine in the right place, what they're hearing is, Rah, 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 rah. They're not getting anything from that. We have 3 major medications for opioids, and one of those is naltrexone, and naltrexone actually blocks opioids, so it doesn't necessarily increase dopamine. But for some people with a less severe substance use disorder or motivation, again, there's that term motivation. When we talk about motivation, I always want you to think dopamine. If you hear dopamine, I want you to think motivation. Motivation equals dopamine, dopamine equals motivation. So when we talk about, I really want a motivated patient or client to go get their therapy, we're talking about someone who has enough dopamine to have that motivation. Without it, they're not motivated. We talk about this in a number of different ways. We talk about it in stages of change. Are they pre-contemplative? Are they in the action phase? Do they want to come and do something positive for themselves? We use these really pejorative terms in addiction medicine like, well, they need to hit rock bottom first. I don't think that's an option anymore, given that we had 50,000 people die last year of overdose, because that's rock bottom for an opioid use disorder. But for those patients who have a lesser version of opioid use disorder, maybe something like a naltrexone, which is a chemical that blocks this opioid, can be really helpful for them because they already have that intrinsic motivation. They're already ready to move forward because they have this dopamine. We also have other parts of the brain, like where alcohol works. It works on another part of the brain other than the opioid receptors. It works in the gamma aminobutyric acid receptors, right? These really specific receptors that they're the ones that make you feel super happy after 1 or 2 drinks, and then not so super happy after 4 or 5 drinks. It's also the same part of the brain that drugs like benzodiazepines, which are like Ativan and Valium or diazepam, these are things that change that part of the brain. What about parts of the brain that are affected by marijuana? So marijuana releases dopamine from the nucleus accumbens, and we found that we have a drug that actually blocks that extra release of dopamine. So for people with a marijuana use disorder, we even have medication that can change the way that dopamine is released. So for certain drugs, it's all about dopamine. And for other drugs, it's indirectly about dopamine. But the final common pathway is dopamine. And whether you have the motivation to onboard therapy and the ability to stay retained in treatment. One of the other things to think about is the whole point of decreasing craving is what? Think about it. To keep the patient from relapsing. That's the whole point. Because if you have craving, you're more likely to go out and actually get a drug, or take a drug, or steal something to go get a drug. So how would we decrease that relapse? So there's some interesting research that's out there right now that talks about the more decisions we make in a day, the less likely we are to make a good decision later. This research that was originally done by parole boards, so they looked at the decision whether or not someone would be able to be let go from jail out on parole. And they took the parole board and they looked at the decisions they made in the morning when they were fresh, when they first started making decisions, versus those decisions they made generally later in the day. And what they found that if your case was heard early in the morning, you were 3 times more likely to be let go as compared to being heard in the afternoon. Everything else was the same. The severity of crimes, the color of your skin, male or female, it didn't matter. What it came down to is there's a point at which your brain is done taking risk or doing something different. And for people who know that they can stabilize their dopamine, who know that they can feel normal, risk is saying no to that. The regular decision, the easiest decision, is to say yes to that. So think about if you wake up in the morning and the first thing you think of is, please don't let me use today. And the second immediate thing you think of is, how can I get my drug of choice? And then you have to say no to that. And then about every 5 seconds after that, over and over and over again, you're having to say no to that thought. And then if you're walking down the street and somebody comes up to you, you have to say no to that, and you have to be in the right frame of mind. By the end of the day, if we haven't controlled craving in any other way, we're going to have someone who has run out of the capability to make the decision that they want to make. And their brain will chemically not be able to make the right decision. It is not like somebody draws a pros and cons sheet on the refrigerator and starts talking about the pros and cons of whether they're going to go buy drugs today. This is not how it works. Decision fatigue is a huge player in what happens in the afternoon or evenings for these patients, because by the end of that day, they have said no 10,000 times. And that 10,001st time may be the time that they relapse. And so using medications and other therapies to significantly decrease craving is really important. We have treatments for opioid use disorder that are 75% effective. We have treatments for alcohol use disorder that are 65 to 70% effective. These are numbers that are better than any other disease. I mean, we have 75% rates for like strep throat with an antibiotic. There's still 25% that don't actually get better. But when you start looking at things like diabetes and hypertension, these are people who getting better looks at about 45 to 50%. We have this thing called the ASAM criteria, and this criteria has been validated and is used in almost every state in the country. Behavioral health interventions also have a long history of being really helpful for these populations, anywhere from one-on-one therapy to group therapy to self-help therapy. These are all things that when applied to the right patient at the right time, absolutely can increase this. Medication-assisted treatment for all addictions that have medications should be thought of right out of the gates to help stabilize that craving so that the rest of these things can be helpful. So when we look at opioid use disorder and we have methadone, which is 75% effective, buprenorphine, that's about 65% effective, naltrexone, which is anywhere from 25 to 60% effective, and yet less than 10% of people even have access to these meds, that's amazing to me. Well, what about alcohol use disorder? Remember, we talked about 15 million people have an alcohol use disorder, and we have medications that have for a long time shown really effective treatment. And those are naltrexone, again, which for both of these, acamprosate, gabapentin, disulfiram, and even baclofen. These meds that we use all the time and feel very comfortable with can be used to help decrease that craving so that we can increase the likelihood that behavioral therapies will work. And then when we look at medication-assisted treatment for marijuana, we actually have a medication for that, N-acetylcysteine. This is a med that's benign in all other capacities, but can help to really get a patient successful without making it so tough for every single person that comes through. What about society? Like, is there an approach that we should be taking from a societal effort? Yeah, I think one, we have to start really taking a hard look at stigma. And in fact, I would reframe stigma and turn it into discrimination. Because we're at a point where if you come into the emergency department after an overdose and you're released 30 minutes after you arrive, as compared to someone who's had chest pain and gets admitted and gets all of these testing, that's discrimination. That's not stigma. And so we have to start understanding that we are not doing ethical things to these patients when they show up. Science is the basis for the approach that we need to take, not a belief. You can use your belief system in how you apply the evidence-based science. In fact, I think for patients, that's probably a better way to do it, but you can't use a belief system as the science. This is doing a great disservice to patients, and we have to start pulling those together in the way that it should be. In the criminal justice world, we have to stop criminalizing these patients for having a disease that we have a treatment for. We know that that behavior can be defined based on craving. We know that craving can be seen on a functional MRI. We know that it's greater than starvation and dehydration. And most importantly, we know we have treatments for this. So to take someone who has very obvious behaviors of addiction and put them in jail with no treatment doesn't make any sense. And when we start to look at how we prevent this disease, it has to be giving accurate, appropriate knowledge to the kids. Not telling them to just say no. Not frying an egg in a pan and telling them that's what their brain looks like. Knowledge and education in the same sense that we would give anyone else. The thing that I need you to walk away with after this video is that addiction is a predictable, chronic brain disease, not a moral failing. It has treatments that are 60 to 75% effective. It has behavioral therapies that are well identified and we can apply on a regular basis, and that the fundamental funnel for all addictions is in this dopamine and reward axis. That part of the brain is responsible for motivation and ultimately survival. And if we can use the science to affect survival in these patients, then we will absolutely come out ahead.
All right. Well, that concludes our meeting for today. We will get a schedule out for 2022 meetings, and absent anything else,